Case 1. Susan Cummings. Wealth can buy many things, but one billionaire heiress discovered it couldn't buy freedom from consequence after pulling a trigger 4 times on a September morning in 1997. Susan Cummings wasn't born into ordinary wealth. Her father, Samuel Cummings, had built an international empire through arms dealing, creating a fortune that placed his twin daughters among the world's wealthiest heirs. Born in Monte Carlo and raised across Europe, Susan and her sister Diana eventually settled on their father's gift to them, a sprawling 340-acre estate in Warrenton, Virginia, called Ashland Farms. The property sat on the edge of Virginia's horse country, where old money and equestrian culture mingled in quiet elegance. Susan, then 35, lived a secluded existence there, rarely venturing beyond the stone walls of the main residence, a 200-year-old structure that had once housed Union troops during the Civil War. Her world remained insular until she decided to explore polo. Through that pursuit, she met Roberto Villegas, an Argentine player who brought skill, charm, and ambition to Virginia's polo circuit. Villegas, 38, at the time they connected, came from entirely different circumstances. Raised in a modest Argentine village, he'd worked his way into international polo through talent and determination. When Susan offered him a position as the resident professional for her newly established Ashland Farms Polo Club, he accepted. Their professional relationship evolved into something more personal. By 1997, the relationship had begun showing fractures. Susan controlled nearly every aspect of their connection. She paid his rent, covered his expenses, and provided stabling for his horses. Villegas had no independent income, making him financially dependent on her goodwill. Friends later described tension brewing between them through the summer months, with Susan reporting to authorities in August that Villegas had become volatile during discussions about ending their involvement. September 7th arrived with Villegas scheduled to represent Argentina in a polo tournament that morning. His equipment remained stored at Ashland Farms, so he drove to the estate before the match. What happened next, inside the second kitchen of the main house, would become the subject of intense legal scrutiny. Around 9 in the morning, Susan placed a call to emergency services. Her voice on the recorded line remained measured, almost clinical. She told the dispatcher she needed to report someone had been wounded, that the person was deceased, and that she discharged a weapon because he'd attempted to harm her. Deputies from Fauquier County arrived within 10 minutes. What they discovered raised immediate questions. Villegas lay on the kitchen floor, surrounded by pooling blood that had already begun separating, a sign suggesting he'd been there at least 30 minutes before authorities received notification. 4. Spent shell casings from a pistol littered the area near his body. A knife rested between his bicep and forearm. Susan showed investigators marks on her left arm, claiming Villegas had attacked her with the blade during an argument. Yet the scene felt oddly arranged. The kitchen appeared unnaturally tidy for a location where a violent struggle had purportedly occurred. The blood pattern suggested Villegas had remained stationary during the incident rather than engaged in combat. Investigators noted forensic evidence indicating the bullet's trajectories angled downward, consistent with someone firing while the victim sat rather than stood in aggressive confrontation. Questions multiplied about why Susan had waited before summoning help if she'd truly acted in immediate self-defense. As detectives interviewed people connected to the couple, contrasting portraits emerged. Those who knew Villegas described a charismatic figure beloved in polo circles, someone known for patience and kindness. But stable workers and others close to Susan told investigators about volatile moments they'd witnessed, including one account of Villegas striking Susan and allegedly making threatening statements. The investigation revealed Susan had filed a domestic incident report weeks earlier, though she declined to pursue a restraining order. Authorities charged her with first-degree murder that same day. She was held overnight before posting bond and returning to Ashland Farms to await trial. The case drew immediate national attention. The wealthy arms heiress and the immigrant polo player, their relationship ending in violence inside a mansion on Virginia's most exclusive estates. When the trial commenced in spring 1998, Susan's defense maintained she'd fired only after Villegas threatened her life, that years of escalating intimidation had culminated in a moment where she believed death was imminent. Prosecutors presented a different narrative. They argued the forensic evidence contradicted her account entirely. The downward bullet paths suggested Villegas had been seated, possibly eating breakfast, when Susan opened fire. They theorized she'd inflicted the cuts on her own arm to support a fabricated self-defense claim. Witnesses described Susan as someone who'd exerted control over every aspect of Villegas's existence, and prosecutors suggested that control had extended to deciding when that existence would end. On May 13, 1998, the jury reached a verdict. They convicted Susan Cummings of voluntary manslaughter rather than the more serious murder charge. Then came the sentencing recommendation that would spark national outrage. Though the jury could have imposed up to 10 years imprisonment, they settled on 60 days in county jail, along with a $2,500 fine. She would serve 57 days before release. The sentence ignited fierce debate across Virginia and beyond. Critics pointed to the disparity between her punishment and typical manslaughter sentences, suggesting wealth had influenced the outcome. Supporters countered that the jury had considered all evidence and shown appropriate mercy. Regardless of perspective, the minimal consequences stood in stark contrast to the life that had been extinguished. In 2003, Villegas's family filed a $15 million civil wrongful death lawsuit. Susan eventually settled for an undisclosed amount. She sold Ashland Farms in 2004 for nearly $5 million and relocated to another substantial property in Culpeper County with her sister. She disappeared from public view, rarely mentioned except in discussions about wealth's influence on justice. The case of Susan Cummings became emblematic of questions that continue echoing through courtrooms today, whether privilege shields some from accountability that others face routinely, whether self-defense claims receive equal scrutiny regardless of who makes them, and whether a life's value gets measured differently depending on who takes it. For Roberto Villegas, those questions came too late. For Susan Cummings, they resulted in less than 2 months behind bars for pulling a trigger 4 times on a Virginia morning. The same year Susan walked free after her brief incarceration, another case was developing, one that would culminate in terror spreading across an entire region and claim 10 innocent lives in just 3 weeks. Case 2. John Allen Muhammad. For 22 days in October 2002, fear held an entire metropolitan region hostage as an unseen predator turned ordinary moments into fatal encounters. John Allen Williams was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on the final day of 1960. His early years unfolded in poverty and instability, circumstances that would follow him into adulthood. He enlisted in the United States Army, where he served with the Louisiana National Guard before transferring to active duty. Military records show he demonstrated skill as a marksman, earning expert ratings in rifle qualification. He served during the Gulf War, receiving commendations for his performance. Yet beneath the surface of military competence, personal turmoil brewed. After joining the Nation of Islam in 1987, he changed his surname to Muhammad. His marriage to Mildred produced 3 children, but the union fractured amid allegations of domestic discord. Court documents from custody battles painted a picture of escalating conflict, with restraining orders filed and visitation disputes intensifying. By 2001, Muhammad had grown estranged from his family, harboring resentment that acquaintances later described as consuming. During this period, he forged a connection with a Jamaican teenager named Lee Boyd Malvo. The 17-year-old had arrived in the United States seeking opportunity, but instead found himself drawn into Muhammad's orbit. Those who observed their dynamic later described a relationship where the older man exerted profound influence over the youth, molding him through a combination of mentorship and manipulation. Beginning in February 2002, a pattern emerged across multiple states, seemingly random incidents where individuals were wounded or killed by distant rifle fire. Authorities in Arizona, Louisiana, Texas, and Washington investigated separate cases without initially recognizing connections. A man practicing golf in Tucson fell to a single shot. Another victim was struck outside a restaurant in Maryland. Each incident appeared isolated until investigators began comparing details. Then came October. On the second day of the month, a man crossing a parking lot in Wheaton, Maryland, died from a rifle round fired from concealed distance. The following day brought 5 more fatalities across Maryland and the District of Columbia. People pumping gasoline, walking through parking areas, sitting on benches. All became targets in attacks that followed no predictable pattern. Panic spread as residents realized nowhere felt safe. Law enforcement formed a massive task force, but the perpetrators remained invisible. The attacks continued. A 13-year-old boy was wounded outside his school. A woman fell while vacuuming her van. A bus driver died at his vehicle. With each incident, fear intensified. Gas stations erected tarps to shield customers. Schools locked down. Parents kept children indoors. The entire Washington metropolitan area existed under siege from an enemy no one could identify. The investigation struggled initially, pursuing leads that led nowhere. Then came the breakthrough. A message left at one scene mentioned an incident in Alabama, a liquor store robbery murder that hadn't been connected to the Washington attacks. Investigators traced that clue to John Allen Muhammad. Further research revealed his association with Malvo and uncovered that Muhammad possessed a Bushmaster rifle chambered in the same caliber used in the attacks. On October 24th, authorities surrounded a rest stop off Interstate 70 in Maryland, where a blue Chevrolet Caprice matching the description sat parked. Inside, Muhammad and Malvo slept. Their arrest came without resistance. Examination of the vehicle revealed modifications that made it a mobile sniper's nest, a hole cut near the license plate, allowing shots to be fired from within the trunk, heavy window tinting obscuring the interior, and a hinged rear seat providing access from the passenger compartment. Evidence recovered from the vehicle proved overwhelming. The Bushmaster rifle matched ballistics from multiple scenes. A laptop contained maps marking attack locations and potential escape routes. Voice recordings captured extortion demands the pair had made. The scope of their plan became clear during investigation. They'd traveled across states over months, refining their methods and selecting victims seemingly at random. Virginia prosecutors moved first, trying Muhammad for the murder of Dean Harold Myers at a Prince William County gas station. Commonwealth's attorney had earned reputation for securing death penalties, and Virginia's appeals process moved faster than other jurisdictions where attacks had occurred. In November 2003, after a trial that lasted weeks, the jury convicted Muhammad on all charges, including capital murder, under Virginia's anti-terrorism statute. They unanimously recommended death. The judge concurred, formally sentencing Muhammad to execution in March 2004. Appeals followed over subsequent years, but courts consistently upheld the conviction and sentence. Muhammad's defense team argued he suffered from mental illness stemming from Gulf War service, and that brain damage rendered him incompetent to make legal decisions. The Virginia Supreme Court rejected these arguments, as did federal courts. In 2005, Maryland extradited Muhammad to face charges there. He was convicted on 6 additional first-degree murder counts, receiving 6 consecutive life sentences. Returned to Virginia afterward, He awaited execution while potential trials in other jurisdictions remained pending. September 2009 brought the setting of his execution date, November 10th. His attorneys petitioned the Supreme Court for a stay, citing incomplete appeals in other cases. The court denied the request. They then sought clemency from Virginia Governor Tim Kaine, arguing Muhammad's mental state and service record warranted mercy. The governor declined, finding no compelling reason to intervene. On the evening of November 10th, 2009, John Allen Muhammad was escorted to the execution chamber at Greensville Correctional Center. When offered opportunity for final words, he remained silent, declining even to acknowledge witnesses present. The lethal injection process began at 9:06. 5 minutes later, he was pronounced deceased. His body was cremated, ashes given to family in Louisiana. His execution brought closure for some families devastated by the attacks, though others questioned whether his death provided genuine resolution. The teenager who'd accompanied him remained imprisoned, serving multiple life terms for his role in the terror campaign. The DC sniper case changed how law enforcement approached random attack scenarios and highlighted vulnerabilities in public spaces that most had never considered. It demonstrated how two individuals with a rifle and a modified vehicle could paralyze an entire region, and it left scars on communities that persist decades later. But while Muhammad's execution marked the end of one nightmare, another case involving a woman with limited intellectual capacity would soon force Virginia to confront whether the death penalty applied equally to all who committed terrible acts. Case 3. Teresa Lewis. In a rural Virginia trailer, greed disguised itself as devotion until the early morning hours of October 30th, 2002, when promises of intimacy became tools for orchestrating death. Teresa Wilson had navigated through life carrying limitations others didn't face. Born in October 1969, she'd grown up in circumstances marked by economic struggle and emotional vulnerability. As an adult, she worked various jobs but never achieved stability. Her relationships followed similar patterns, fleeting connections that dissolved under pressure, leaving her searching for something permanent. That yearning would ultimately lead her to commit acts she'd later claim to regret with every breath. In his 50s, Julian Clifton Lewis had already endured profound loss. His first wife passed after nearly 30 years together, leaving him to grieve while caring for their grown children. Jason, serving in the Navy, Kathy, who'd moved home to support him, and CJ, a 25-year-old Army reservist, building a promising future. When Teresa entered Julian's life just 4 months after his wife's passing, he was vulnerable, seeking comfort anywhere it appeared. She provided attention during a period when loneliness felt overwhelming. They married, creating a blended household that included Teresa's own children from previous relationships. The marriage brought Teresa into Julian's world, but it also exposed her to something she'd never experienced: significant assets. Julian owned property, maintained savings, and most notably, his son CJ had secured a substantial life insurance policy as he prepared for deployment to Iraq. The policy's value exceeded $250,000. Teresa learned about this coverage, and somewhere in her mind, a plan began forming. Enter Matthew Schallenberger, a young man Teresa encountered through social circles in Pittsylvania County. He was 19, ambitious in all the wrong ways, speaking openly about dreams of becoming involved in organized crime. Teresa cultivated a relationship with him that mixed manipulation with promises. She offered intimacy, spoke of shared futures, and dangled financial rewards if he'd help eliminate obstacles to her accessing Julian's wealth. She introduced Schallenberger to Rodney Fuller, another young man she'd recruited to her scheme. Teresa's strategy relied on raw incentive. She promised both men cash from the insurance proceeds. She offered herself in exchange for their participation, She even facilitated encounters between her teenage daughter and one of the co-conspirators, using every tool available to secure their cooperation. The men agreed, believing Teresa's assurances that the payoff would justify the act. On the night of October 29th into early October 30th, the plan reached execution. Teresa provided access to the mobile home where Julian and CJ slept. She supplied the weapon, a rifle her husband had been temporarily storing. Then she positioned herself in the kitchen as Schallenberger and Fuller entered the residence. The gunman fired multiple rounds into Julian and CJ as they lay in their beds. Julian survived the initial attack, wounded grievously but conscious. Teresa approached him as he struggled, rifling through his pockets for whatever cash he carried. His final words, later included in court documents, haunted the case. He told responders that his wife knew who'd done this to him. Teresa waited before calling authorities, allowing time to pass that investigators would later question. When she finally summoned help, she claimed to have discovered the scene after the fact. But emergency personnel arriving within minutes of her call found blood that had already begun coagulating, suggesting the attack had occurred well before notification. The investigation moved swiftly. Within a week, Teresa attempted to withdraw $50,000 from Julian's account using a forged instrument. Authorities caught the fraudulent transaction. When questioned, Teresa's story unraveled. She confessed to arranging the murders, revealing the conspiracy in detail. Prosecutors discovered she'd begun gathering information about accessing her late husband and stepson's assets even before their bodies had been buried. During trial proceedings in 2003, the evidence overwhelmed any defense strategy. Teresa's own admissions provided the foundation of the prosecution's case. Testimony from Schallenberger and Fuller corroborated the conspiracy. Financial records documented her attempts at theft. The judge presiding over the case called Teresa the head of this serpent, emphasizing that despite not pulling the trigger herself, she'd orchestrated every element of the crimes. Defense attorneys advised her that fighting the charges would likely result in harsher punishment. She entered guilty pleas to capital murder, hoping cooperation might inspire leniency. Instead, the judge imposed death sentences. Schallenberger and Fuller, the actual gunmen, received life imprisonment through separate proceedings, a disparity that would fuel controversy as execution approached. Appeals proceeded through Virginia's court system over subsequent years. Teresa's attorneys emphasized her intellectual limitations. Court-appointed psychiatric evaluation determined her IQ measured 72, placing her near the threshold where many states define intellectual disability. They argued executing someone with her cognitive capacity violated constitutional protections. Courts rejected these arguments, finding she'd understood her actions sufficiently to plan complex schemes and assist investigators. As September 2010 approached, Teresa's case attracted international attention. Over 7,000 clemency appeals reached Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell's office. Supporters emphasized her remorse, her exemplary conduct during incarceration, and questions about proportionality, given that the actual shooters avoided execution. Critics countered that she demonstrated calculated cruelty, using manipulation and promises to convince others to commit murder, waiting while her husband lay dying, attempting theft before his burial. On September 17th, Governor McDonnell announced his decision. He'd found no compelling reason to set aside the sentence imposed by courts. The execution would proceed as scheduled. Teresa spent her final days in prayer and song, meeting with her children and writing private letters. She requested a final meal of fried chicken, sweet peas with butter, German chocolate cake, and Dr. Pepper. On the evening of September 23rd, she entered the execution chamber at Greensville Correctional Center. Witnesses described her as appearing frightened yet resigned. When offered opportunity for last words, she spoke briefly, an apology directed at Kathy, her stepdaughter, who'd lost both father and brother to Teresa's scheme. The lethal injection process commenced at 9 that evening. She was pronounced deceased at 9:13, becoming the first woman executed in Virginia since 1912. Her death reignited debates about capital punishment, whether intellectual capacity should preclude execution, whether gender influences sentencing, and whether orchestrators deserve harsher punishment than those who physically commit crimes. The teenager who'd also manipulated and used young accomplices would face similar questions about youth, influence, and proportional justice. Case 4. Lee Boyd, Malvo. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't carried in someone's hands, but planted in their mind by someone who understands precisely how to exploit youth and desperation. Lee Boyd Malvo entered the world on February 18, 1985, in Kingston, Jamaica. His childhood unfolded in instability. A mother struggling with her own demons, limited economic resources, and an absence of consistent guidance. By his early teenage years, he'd become accustomed to uncertainty, moving between relatives and temporary arrangements. That vulnerability made him perfect prey when John Allen Muhammad crossed his path. The circumstances of their meeting remain debated, but what's certain is that by 2000 or 2001, Malvo had connected with Muhammad in Antigua, where the teenager's mother had relocated. Muhammad recognized something in the youth: malleability, intelligence without direction, and profound loneliness. He began cultivating a relationship that others would later describe as indoctrination rather than mentorship. Muhammad filled the void where a father figure should have existed, but the guidance he provided served sinister purposes. Muhammad crafted an elaborate narrative for the impressionable teenager. He spoke of grand schemes involving ransom demands that would fund utopian communities for displaced Black youth in Canada. He framed violence as revolutionary action rather than criminal depravity. He trained Malvo in marksmanship and tactical thinking, transforming a lost adolescent into an instrument for carrying out calculated attacks. The process included exposure to materials glorifying violence and extended sessions where Muhammad reinforced his control over every aspect of Malvo's worldview. By early 2002, they'd begun implementing Muhammad's plan. They traveled across states, committing what appeared to be random acts of violence. Malvo later confessed to incidents in Washington, Arizona, Louisiana, and Texas. Attacks that left some deceased and others permanently affected. Each served as preparation for the campaign that would begin in October. During those 22 days in the Washington metropolitan region, Malvo operated alongside Muhammad as the terror unfolded. The modified Chevrolet Caprice became their mobile platform, with Malvo often positioned in the trunk area where the firing position had been established. He participated in surveillance, target selection, and execution of attacks that paralyzed millions with fear. Later testimony revealed Muhammad had been the primary shooter in most incidents, but Malvo acknowledged firing the fatal round in at least one attack. Their arrest on October 24th came at a Maryland rest stop. Malvo was 17 years old, facing charges that could result in execution under Virginia law. Because federal authorities wanted swift justice, and Virginia offered both the death penalty and expedited appeals, prosecutors there moved first. Malvo's case presented unique challenges. His defense team pursued an insanity plea, arguing Muhammad had exercised such complete psychological control that Malvo couldn't be held fully accountable for his actions. They presented psychiatric experts who described the relationship as textbook manipulation of a vulnerable minor. Testimony revealed Muhammad had isolated Malvo from outside influences, created dependency through meeting basic needs, and systematically shaped the teenager's beliefs to align with his own violent objectives. The prosecution countered with evidence of Malvo's active participation. Drawings recovered from his possessions depicted the attacks with disturbing detail, some labeled as elements of jihad. Witnesses testified about his composure during planning sessions. Forensic evidence placed him at multiple scenes. The state argued that regardless of Muhammad's influence, Malvo had possessed sufficient awareness to understand his actions constituted serious crimes. Due to intense pretrial publicity, the proceedings relocated from Fairfax County to Chesapeake, Virginia, over 150 miles from where attacks had occurred. The trial commenced in November 2003. Prosecutors sought death while defense attorneys fought for their client's life, emphasizing his youth and the coercive nature of his relationship with Muhammad. After nearly 14 hours of deliberation in December 2003, the jury convicted Malvo of capital murder, terrorism, and weapons charges. During the penalty phase, they recommended life imprisonment without possibility of parole rather than execution. The judge concurred, formally imposing that sentence in March 2004. Malvo then negotiated plea agreements in Spotsylvania, County, Virginia, accepting additional life terms and waiving appeal rights in exchange for avoiding further death penalty prosecutions. Maryland later sought him on charges from attacks in that jurisdiction. In 2009, Malvo pleaded guilty to 6 first-degree murder counts, receiving 6 additional life sentences. The cumulative punishment ensured he'd never taste freedom again. However, legal developments would later complicate this certainty. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The court subsequently applied this ruling retroactively. Malvo's attorneys filed petitions arguing his Virginia sentences should be vacated because juries hadn't been given discretion to consider his youth as a mitigating factor. In 2017, a federal judge agreed, overturning Malvo's Virginia sentences and ordering resentencing hearings. Appeals courts upheld this decision. Virginia's Attorney General fought back, but the Supreme Court eventually declined to intervene. By 2020, Virginia had passed legislation making juvenile offenders sentenced to life eligible for parole after serving 20 years, fundamentally altering Malvo's situation. Today, Lee Boyd Malvo remains incarcerated at Keene Mountain Correctional Center in Virginia. He's expressed remorse for his actions, acknowledging the immeasurable harm caused. In interviews conducted years after the attacks, he's described the psychological manipulation he experienced and his gradual recognition of how Muhammad had exploited his youth. He married while imprisoned and has cooperated with researchers studying radicalization and juvenile culpability. His case continues generating debate about where accountability lies when adults manipulate minors into committing atrocities. Some view him as a victim who became a perpetrator through circumstances beyond his control. Others see someone who made conscious choices to participate in terror, regardless of his age, or the influence exerted. The families who lost loved ones during those 22 days in October hold varying perspectives. Some have expressed forgiveness, while others maintain that mercy should have limits. The legal questions surrounding Malvo's sentences remain unresolved as jurisdictions navigate new Supreme Court precedent. Whether he'll ever face parole boards or spend his remaining decades behind bars without possibility of release continues evolving through ongoing legal proceedings. While Muhammad met his end in Virginia's execution chamber, the teenager he transformed into a weapon confronts a different fate. Decades of imprisonment, contemplating how a search for belonging led him into America's darkest nightmare. But as one young person's path to destruction raised questions about manipulation and accountability, another case would soon emerge where a different kind of exploitation would leave an entire family shattered. Case 5. Megan Hargan. Envy can simmer quietly for years until the day it boils over, transforming resentment into irreversible violence within a wealthy family's suburban sanctuary. Pamela Hargan had built an impressive life through decades of diligent work. By her early 60s, she'd risen to become a successful business executive with an estate valued at $8 million. Her McLean, Virginia residence reflected that achievement, a substantial home in one of the Washington area's most affluent communities. After her husband's passing, Pamela focused her energy on supporting her adult daughters, each navigating their own paths forward. She believed in providing opportunities while maintaining reasonable boundaries about how her resources would be allocated. Helen Hargan, 24 years old, had been living with her mother while planning her next chapter. Pamela had agreed to purchase a home for Helen, a generous gesture that would allow the younger woman to establish independence. The property search had progressed to the point where contracts were being finalized. Helen also maintained a relationship with Carlos Gutierrez, who lived in Texas but intended to relocate once Helen's new residence was ready. Megan Hargan, Helen's older sister by over a decade, occupied a different position within the family dynamic. At 34, she'd married and had a young daughter but struggled financially. She'd been living in Pamela's home along with Helen, ostensibly temporarily, while attempting to purchase property in West Virginia. Unlike the assistance Pamela provided Helen, Megan's requests for comparable support met resistance. Pamela had concerns about Megan's financial management and declined to simply transfer hundreds of thousands of dollars without proper oversight. That disparity festered. While Helen received help toward home ownership, Megan watched her own plans stall. The contrast between her circumstances and her younger sister's situation created resentment that grew with each passing week. By July 2017, Megan had reached a breaking point. Her West Virginia property closing was scheduled, but she lacked the funds to complete the transaction. On July 13th, Megan made her move. She contacted Pamela's bank, impersonating her mother, and attempted to wire transfer over $400,000 from Pamela's account to her own. The transaction raised immediate fraud alerts. Bank security protocols froze the funds and flagged the suspicious activity. Megan's scheme had failed, but she'd already committed herself to a path she couldn't reverse. The following morning, July 14th, brought the culmination of Megan's desperation. She retrieved a rifle her husband had been storing at Pamela's residence. Around mid-morning, she approached her mother in the home's mudroom area. What happened next would be revealed through forensic analysis rather than witness testimony. Megan fired, striking Pamela with fatal force. She then arranged her mother's body, placing a blanket over it, with Pamela's cell phone positioned as though dropped during a struggle. Helen was upstairs when the first shots rang out. Terrified and confused, she contacted her boyfriend in Texas. During that call, Helen made a chilling statement. She told Carlos that Megan had informed her about ending their mother's life. Gutierrez later testified that Helen seemed frightened, but also concerned for Megan's young daughter, reluctant to flee and leave the child potentially in danger. He begged Helen to escape immediately, but she hesitated. That hesitation cost her everything. Megan couldn't allow Helen to survive as a witness. She went upstairs, confronting her sister in the bathroom. Using the same rifle, she fired a shot that entered the top of Helen's head, traveling downward into her neck. She then staged the scene to suggest self-infliction, positioning the rifle between Helen's legs and arranging the area to imply a tragic conclusion to a murder-suicide scenario where Helen had supposedly attacked their mother before taking her own life. Around 1:15 that afternoon, Helen's phone went silent. Carlos Gutierrez, growing increasingly panicked, contacted Fairfax County Emergency Services. He explained what Helen had told him and expressed fear that something terrible had happened to her as well. Dispatchers treated the call seriously, sending patrol officers to the residence. When authorities arrived before 3 that afternoon, they discovered Pamela first, positioned exactly as Megan had arranged her. Upstairs, they found Helen with the rifle nearby. Initial assessments suggested the scene might indeed represent a murder-suicide. Police even told reporters that preliminary evidence pointed toward Helen's wound being self-inflicted. The Hargan family was informed of that working theory. But Detective Brian Byerson wasn't satisfied. Details bothered him. The angle of Helen's wound, the positioning of the weapon, the logistics of how someone Helen's size could have maneuvered the rifle to create that specific trajectory. He made a crucial decision. They would wait, investigate thoroughly, and follow evidence rather than assumptions. As the investigation progressed, Megan's fraud attempts came to light. Detectives discovered her impersonation of Pamela to the bank. They found evidence of her desperate financial situation and her resentment toward Helen. Forensic analysis of the rifle and wound patterns contradicted the suicide theory. The medical examiner's findings indicated the shot had been fired by someone else. 5 days after the incident, Byerson brought Megan in for an extended interview, lasting over 4 hours. She admitted to the fraud, but denied the murders, maintaining that Helen must have committed the crimes. Authorities didn't arrest her that day. Instead, they continued building their case over the following months. On November 9, 2018, nearly 17 months after the deaths, Megan was finally taken into custody and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Her trial commenced years later due to pandemic-related delays. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: the fraudulent bank transactions, forensic analysis contradicting defense theories, and testimony from Carlos Gutierrez about Helen's frightened phone call. Defense attorneys argued Helen had indeed committed the crimes, suggesting she'd used her toes to manipulate the rifle trigger and had covered them with socks to avoid leaving forensic evidence. The jury didn't find that theory credible. In March 2022, Megan was convicted of both murders. But her legal journey wasn't finished. One of the jurors had conducted an experiment at home, using her own rifle to test whether the defense's theory was physically possible. She'd shared her findings with fellow jurors during deliberations. The defense successfully argued this constituted misconduct since jurors had been instructed not to conduct outside research. In November 2022, the judge vacated the conviction. A second trial was scheduled for September 2023. Once again, prosecutors presented their case. Once again, the jury deliberated. And once again, on September 22nd, they returned guilty verdicts on both first-degree murder charges. This time, the convictions held. On January 26, 2024, Megan received her sentence: 2 life terms, plus 6 additional years for weapons charges. She'll spend the rest of her existence in Virginia's prison system, her daughter growing up without either parent present, the family she envied now reduced to a single surviving sister, and memories of a day when financial jealousy became familial annihilation. The Megan Hargan case stands as testament to how quickly internal resentment can transform into irreversible tragedy when opportunity and desperation collide. While she planned to steal money to secure her future, she instead secured only the certainty of life behind bars for destroying her past. Yet even as that modern case concluded, another dark chapter from Virginia's history reminds us that monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they operate in spaces we consider safe, hiding behind personas we're taught to trust. Case 6. Jesse Matthew. Monsters don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they drive taxis, work hospital shifts, and blend seamlessly into communities while hunting in plain sight. Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. entered the world in 1982, growing up in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he'd later commit crimes that would shatter families and expose how predators can operate undetected for years. By outward appearances, he seemed unremarkable. A large man with an easy smile who worked various jobs, including cab driver and hospital orderly. Those who encountered him casually described him as friendly enough, but beneath that facade lived something far more sinister. His pattern began early. In 2002, while attending Liberty University, allegations surfaced regarding inappropriate conduct. Rather than face consequences, he departed immediately. The following year, at Christopher Newport University, another incident occurred. Again, he left before formal proceedings could commence. The pattern of avoidance and escape was established, though authorities at the time failed to connect these dots into a larger picture of predatory behavior. In September 2005, a woman in Fairfax, Virginia, was attacked with brutal force, dragged into an isolated area and subjected to violence that left her traumatized but alive. Forensic evidence was collected, but the perpetrator remained unidentified. DNA entered databases where it awaited a match that wouldn't arrive for nearly a decade. Had that case been solved promptly, what followed might never have occurred. October 17, 2009, brought an evening that began with anticipation and ended in tragedy. Morgan Harrington, a 20-year-old Virginia Tech student, attended a Metallica concert at the University of Virginia's John Paul Jones Arena with friends. During the performance, she stepped outside. Accounts vary on whether she'd been denied re-entry after leaving or had other reasons for not returning. Surveillance captured her on nearby Copley Bridge, attempting to hitchhike. Then she vanished. Her disappearance launched massive searches. Her parents, Gil and Dan Harrington, became advocates for missing persons, maintaining public pressure as weeks passed without answers. In January 2010, a farmer discovered Morgan's remains in a remote hayfield, approximately 10 miles from where she'd last been seen. The death was ruled homicide, but investigators had limited leads. Forensic evidence from the scene eventually linked to the unsolved 2005 Fairfax assault, suggesting the same person was responsible for both crimes. But the identity of that person remained unknown. Life in Charlottesville continued. Matthew worked his jobs, interacted with residents, and maintained his facade of normalcy. Friends would later admit they'd joked with him about resembling composite sketches released in connection with the Harrington investigation. He laughed along, hiding in plain sight while the community remained unaware. Nearly 5 years passed. On September 12, 2014, Hannah Graham, an 18-year-old University of Virginia sophomore, spent the evening socializing with friends. As the night progressed, she became separated from her group. Text messages indicated she felt disoriented, telling friends she was lost. Surveillance footage captured her walking through downtown Charlottesville, sometimes running, appearing vulnerable and confused. Additional cameras showed her path crossing with Jesse Matthews. He was seen at multiple establishments that evening, with witnesses later reporting he'd made unwanted advances toward several women. Footage captured him approaching Graham, wrapping his arm around her, guiding her toward his vehicle. Witnesses who observed the interaction grew concerned. One followed them to a restaurant called Tempo, where Matthew purchased drinks for himself and the underage Graham. As they left, another witness saw Graham ahead of Matthew on the street, heard her voice sounding elevated and frightened as he caught up to her, and watched as he directed her toward his orange Chrysler Sebring. The witness heard Graham refuse to enter the vehicle, her tone suggesting fear. Within minutes, both were gone. Hannah's disappearance triggered immediate alarm given Morgan Harrington's unsolved case. Massive searches commenced. Police reviewed surveillance extensively, identifying Matthew as the last person seen with Hannah. When they approached him for questioning, he fled. Authorities named him a person of interest, then upgraded that designation to suspect. An arrest warrant issued for abduction with intent to defile, a charge that permitted collection of DNA samples. Matthew drove to Texas, where he was apprehended on a Galveston beach on September 24th. His DNA, once processed, provided the breakthrough investigators had awaited for years. It matched forensic evidence from both Morgan Harrington's homicide and the 2005 Fairfax assault. The predator who'd operated undetected had finally been identified. In October 2014, searchers located Hannah Graham's remains on abandoned property in Albemarle County, approximately 12 miles from campus, and just 6 miles from where Morgan's body had been discovered. The proximity wasn't coincidental. Investigators now understood they were dealing with a serial predator who'd chosen hunting grounds and operated systematically. Matthew faced charges in multiple jurisdictions. The Fairfax case went to trial first in June 2015. Unexpectedly, on the 4th day of proceedings, Matthew entered an Alford plea, acknowledging prosecutors possessed sufficient evidence for conviction without admitting guilt. He received 3 consecutive life sentences for attempted murder and assault. Virginia prosecutors then moved forward on the murder charges. Matthew's attorneys recognized the overwhelming evidence their client faced and negotiated a plea agreement. On March 2, 2016, Matthew appeared in court and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and abduction with intent to defile in both the Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham cases. In exchange for avoiding potential execution, he accepted 4 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. During the proceeding, victims' families delivered impact statements. Sue Graham called her daughter a heroine whose disappearance enabled capture of a serial predator who'd hidden among them for years. Gil Harrington thanked investigators for their determination in finding the top-tier predator that hunted in this community. The composite total of Matthew's sentences, 7 life terms counting the Fairfax convictions, ensured he'd never walk free. He was transported to Red Onion State Prison, Virginia's Supermax facility, where he's been held largely in segregated housing. In May 2019, news emerged that Matthew had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. He was transferred to Sussex Warren State Prison for medical treatment. His current condition remains undisclosed due to medical privacy regulations. The Jesse Matthew case changed how Charlottesville approached campus safety and highlighted systemic failures that allowed him to offend repeatedly without consequences. The early allegations at universities, had they been properly investigated and prosecuted, might have prevented Morgan and Hannah's murders. Instead, a pattern of avoidance permitted a predator to continue hunting until forensic science finally connected the crimes he'd committed over nearly a decade. For the Harrington and Graham families, Matthew's imprisonment provided some measure of closure, though nothing could restore what he'd taken. Both families have since advocated for improved safety measures, better response protocols for missing persons cases, and enhanced awareness about predatory behavior. The back-to-school killer moniker reflected the timing of his crimes, but the real horror lay in recognizing how easily he'd moved through their community undetected. The friendly cab driver, the helpful hospital worker. These personas masked a calculating predator who selected vulnerable victims and exploited their circumstances with chilling precision. While Matthew spends his remaining years imprisoned, another case would soon demonstrate that domestic violence can escalate into premeditated murder when jealousy and rage find opportunity to act. Case 7. Piper Ann Roundtree. Desperation wears many disguises, sometimes literally, when a former attorney crossed state lines wearing a wig to execute a plan born from custody battles and calculation. Piper Ann Roundtree built her professional identity through law, working as both an attorney and prosecutor in Texas, where she'd established what appeared to be a successful career. In the mid-1980s, she met Frederick Jablin, a communications professor whose academic work had earned him respect within university circles. Their marriage produced 3 children, and for nearly 2 decades, they maintained what outsiders perceived as stability. But beneath the surface, fractures were forming that would eventually lead to one of Virginia's most calculated murder cases. By the early 2000s, the marriage had deteriorated beyond repair. The couple divorced in 2002, triggering a custody battle that grew increasingly contentious with each hearing. Frederick, by then working as a professor at the University of Richmond, sought primary custody. Piper fought vigorously to maintain control over the children who represented not just her family, but her sense of control itself. When courts awarded Frederick primary custody, granting Piper only limited visitation rights, she experienced what friends later described as a devastating blow to her identity. The pay-custody arrangement required Piper to relocate to Texas, while the children remained in Virginia with their father. This geographic separation intensified her frustration. She initiated repeated legal challenges, each one failing to overturn the custody decision. Financial pressures mounted alongside emotional ones. Frederick held a substantial life insurance policy, valued at $200,000, money that would become accessible to Piper if something happened to him while their children were still minors. By October 2004, Piper had formulated a plan. She purchased 2 wigs, one blonde, one red, and began preparing for a trip that would require her to move undetected through airports and hotels. Using her sister Tina's identification, she made travel arrangements designed to establish an alibi, suggesting she'd remained in Texas. She practiced at a Houston shooting range, using Tina's identification to purchase ammunition for a .38 caliber weapon. Witnesses later recalled seeing a woman matching Piper's description, training with a firearm in the days preceding what would follow. On October 28th, a woman checked into a Southwest Airlines flight using the name Tina Roundtree. The timing of the flight and the alias immediately caught investigators' attention afterward. Piper flew from Houston to Richmond, Virginia, maintaining her disguise throughout the journey. Hotel clerks who later testified at trial recalled a guest who wore a blonde wig, avoided eye contact, and exhibited nervous behavior. She checked into accommodations near Frederick's suburban Henrico County neighborhood. The early morning hours of October 30th arrived with darkness still blanketing the quiet residential streets. Frederick Jablin rose as usual, preparing to retrieve the morning newspaper from his driveway. Inside the house, his and Piper's 3 children, ages 8, 12, and 15, slept peacefully, unaware of what was about to unfold. Frederick opened his front door and walked toward his vehicle where the paper had been delivered. Piper had positioned herself behind his van, concealed in shadows. As Frederick approached, he sensed movement. He asked who was there. Piper emerged from her hiding position, stating clearly so he'd recognize her voice. "You know who it is, Fred." She fired twice. Both shots struck him fatally. Frederick collapsed in his own driveway as neighbors heard the gunfire echo through the morning quiet. Piper immediately fled the scene, making her way back to Houston, a distance exceeding 500 miles. When neighbors discovered Frederick's body and called authorities, the investigation began swiftly. Detectives quickly focused on Piper given the contentious custody situation. They traced airline records and discovered the suspicious Tina Roundtree booking. Hotel staff provided descriptions matching Piper, wearing a blonde wig. Shooting range witnesses identified her as someone who'd trained with a .38 caliber weapon days before the murder. Cell phone records placed her in Virginia at the time of the incident, despite her claims of being in Texas. Perhaps most damaging was surveillance footage and witness accounts that tracked her movements. She'd left a trail of circumstantial evidence throughout her attempt at creating the perfect alibi. Her constant use of her cell phone enabled GPS tracking that contradicted her stated whereabouts. The elaborate disguise and identity theft had actually made her more memorable to witnesses, rather than allowing her to blend into obscurity. On November 9th, just 10 days after the murder, Piper returned to Virginia for a custody hearing. The court awarded custody of Frederick's children to his brother Michael. 20 minutes after that ruling, detectives arrested Piper on charges of first-degree murder with a firearm enhancement. The same day, her sister Tina was arrested in Houston for evidence tampering after helping destroy the wigs, makeup, papers, and electronic evidence following the murder. Piper's trial commenced on February 22, 2005, in Henrico County Circuit Court. Prosecutors presented what they described as overwhelming circumstantial evidence: the disguise, the borrowed identity, the weapons training, the travel records contradicting her alibi, and the financial motive provided by the life insurance policy. They portrayed Piper as a desperate woman who saw murder as the only path to regaining control over her children and accessing financial resources. When Piper took the stand in her own defense, her testimony proved disastrous. She attempted to suggest her sister Tina had been in Houston while she remained in Texas, claiming people often confused them due to physical similarities. When confronted with evidence contradicting her claims, she either refuted it unconvincingly or claimed ignorance. Her composure deteriorated as questioning continued, making her appear increasingly less credible to jurors. On February 25th, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on both first-degree murder and felonious use of a firearm. Piper could only sob as the verdict was read. The jury recommended life imprisonment, plus 3 years mandatory sentence on the firearm charge. In May of that year, Henrico County Circuit Judge L.A. Harris Jr. formally imposed that sentence, rejecting Piper's plea for mercy and noting she'd committed the murder while her children slept inside their father's home. Piper was transferred to Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women in Troy, Virginia, where she remains today. Over the years, she's filed various complaints about treatment, converted to Buddhism, and reportedly tutors other inmates. Her elaborate scheme to commit what she believed would be the perfect murder instead became a case study in how desperation and overconfidence can leave damning evidence at every turn. The Piper Roundtree case demonstrated that professional credentials and careful planning cannot outsmart thorough investigation when a perpetrator leaves trails of evidence through multiple states. For Frederick Jablin, morning newspaper retrieval became a fatal routine. For their children, October 30th destroyed their family entirely, losing their father to violence and their mother to imprisonment for causing it. While Piper's crime stemmed from custody battles and financial pressure, another case would soon emerge where violence served no rational purpose beyond the perpetrator's desire to inflict terror on an entire family, as celebration turned to slaughter. Case 8. Ricky Javon Gray. The first morning of a new year should bring hope and fresh beginnings. But for one Virginia family, it brought only unspeakable horror when a home invader transformed celebration into carnage. Ricky Javon Gray grew up in circumstances marked by instability and poor choices that accumulated into a criminal record. By his 20s, he'd cycled through encounters with law enforcement, brief incarcerations, and releases that never resulted in genuine rehabilitation. His pattern showed someone comfortable with violence, willing to exploit vulnerability, and lacking the moral barriers that prevent most people from committing atrocities. On New Year's Day, 2006, those characteristics would manifest in one of Richmond's most brutal crimes. The Harvey family, Brian, Catherine, and their young daughters, Stella, age 9, and Ruby, age 4, represented everything Gray was not. Brian and Catherine had built stable lives, contributing to their community and raising their children with love and attention. Their Woodland Heights home stood as testament to years of work creating security for their family. As 2005 turned to 2006, they celebrated quietly at home, tucking their daughters into bed and preparing to begin the new year together. They had no warning that a predator had selected their residence. Gray, along with his nephew, Ray Joseph Dandridge, had been on a crime spree across multiple jurisdictions. They'd committed robberies, assaults, and other offenses while moving between locations to avoid detection. On the afternoon of January 1st, they identified the Harvey home as a target. Whether they initially intended to simply rob the family or had darker purposes from the start remains debated. But what's certain is that once inside, they committed acts of devastating cruelty. The Harveys were bound and rendered helpless. The home invaders moved through the residence systematically. What happened over the following hours defied comprehension, a family subjected to terror in their own sanctuary, while neighbors remained unaware, just walls away. Eventually, the perpetrators set fire to the home in an attempt to destroy evidence. By the time firefighters responded to smoke reports and extinguished the blaze, they discovered a scene that shocked even veteran emergency personnel. 4 bodies, parents and both young children, all victims of violence before the fire had been set. Richmond responded with horror and grief. The Harvey family had been beloved members of their community. Brian worked as a beloved musician and artist. Catherine had been known for her warmth and generosity. Their daughters had barely begun their lives. The randomness of the attack, a family targeted simply because their home appeared accessible, terrified residents who realized it could have been anyone. Evidence collection began immediately. Forensic teams processed the scene meticulously despite fire damage. DNA, fingerprints, and other biological evidence pointed investigators toward suspects. Tips from the public helped authorities identify Gray and Dandridge, who'd already drawn attention for other criminal activity. When apprehended, evidence tied them definitively to the Harvey residence. The legal proceedings that followed brought additional details about the crime's brutality. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the defendant's own statements during interrogation. The scale of cruelty inflicted on the family, particularly the children, generated widespread revulsion. Defense attorneys faced nearly impossible tasks, convincing juries their clients deserved anything other than maximum sentences. In 2006, Ricky Javon Gray was convicted of capital murder. Given the depravity involved, multiple victims, including 2 very young children, killed during commission of another felony, prosecutors had sought and obtained death sentences. Gray was sentenced to execution for transforming a family's celebration into their annihilation. Years of mandatory appeals followed. Gray's legal team raised various arguments challenging both conviction and sentence, but courts consistently upheld the verdicts. The enormity of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the calculated nature of the invasion left little room for judicial mercy. On January 18, 2017, almost 11 years to the day after the murders, Ricky Javon Gray was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center. His co-defendant, Ray Joseph Dandridge, pleaded guilty to the murders of 3 members of the Baskerville Tucker family and received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated in Virginia. Gray declined to make final statements. His execution marked closure for some who'd been devastated by the Harvey family's destruction, though nothing could truly restore what had been taken. The Harvey family murders remain one of Richmond's most traumatic cases. The community established memorials and initiatives to honor the family's memory. The case prompted discussions about home security, random violence, and whether any system could truly prevent such attacks. For those who knew the Harveys, the loss remains profound. A family extinguished by senseless cruelty committed by individuals who viewed other human beings as obstacles to robbery, rather than as people deserving of life. While Gray paid with his life for his crimes, the Harvey family could never be restored. The case stands as reminder that evil sometimes arrives unexpectedly on ordinary days, transforming celebration into tragedy in moments that can never be undone. Yet even as that brutal case demonstrated how violence can shatter the innocent, another story would emerge where fantasy and isolation created a deadly obsession that turned a daughter against her own father. Case 9. Clara Jane Schwartz. Role-playing games offer players escape into fantastical worlds where dragons, swords, and quests replace mundane reality. But when one young woman's fantasy life consumed her completely, the line between game and reality dissolved with lethal consequences. Clara Jane Schwartz grew up as the daughter of Robert Schwartz, a renowned scientist whose work in biophysics had earned him recognition within academic circles. Their home in Leesburg, Virginia, provided material comfort, but Clara's internal world grew increasingly detached from the ordinary teenage experience. She immersed herself in online role-playing communities where she adopted personas, created elaborate backstories, and formed connections with others who shared her interest in fantasy narratives. For most participants, these games remained clearly separated from real life. For Clara, that boundary began to blur. By her late teens, Clara had developed an obsession with occult themes, fantasy violence, and alternative realities, where she imagined herself as powerful and in control. Online, she cultivated an identity that bore little resemblance to her actual existence. She discussed elaborate scenarios involving medieval combat, magical powers, and eliminating enemies. Other players generally understood these discussions as part of the game's narrative. Clara, however, had begun viewing them as blueprints for action in the physical world. Her relationship with her father deteriorated as she aged. Robert Schwartz had expectations for his daughter that Clara resented. She perceived him as controlling, restrictive, and an obstacle to her desired independence. In her online communities, she increasingly discussed Kyle, a character representing her father, and expressed desires to eliminate this obstacle. Friends who interacted with her in gaming forums later testified they'd believed she was simply creating dramatic storylines for her character, not plotting actual violence. In December 2001, Clara recruited individuals she'd met through her gaming activities. She convinced them that her father needed to be removed, framing it initially as part of an elaborate roleplay scenario. As planning progressed, some participants realized Clara intended genuine violence, but by then, they'd become complicit in discussions that could implicate them legally. The plan involved using a sword to attack Robert Schwartz, a method that reflected Clara's fantasy immersion more than practical murder planning. On December 8, 2001, Robert Schwartz was attacked in his own home. The assailant used a sword, stabbing him repeatedly with a weapon that seemed lifted directly from the fantasy worlds Clara inhabited. The brutal nature of the attack, using a medieval weapon rather than conventional means, immediately suggested unusual circumstances. When investigators examined Clara's computer and online activities, they discovered the months of discussion that preceded her father's death. The case generated national attention, partly because it highlighted emerging concerns about online communities, role-playing games, and how fantasy obsession could potentially influence vulnerable individuals toward real violence. Media coverage often focused on the Dungeons and Dragons connection, though gaming experts emphasized that millions of people enjoyed such activities without ever conflating fiction with reality. Clara represented an outlier, someone whose existing psychological issues had been channeled through gaming culture rather than caused by it. During her trial in 2002, prosecutors presented evidence of Clara's extensive planning, her recruitment of accomplices, and her orchestration of her father's murder. Defense attorneys argued she'd been mentally unstable, that her grip on reality had been compromised by obsessive gaming and occult interests. The jury rejected insanity claims, finding Clara guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 48 years in prison, making her eligible for release in 2043, when she'll be 62 years old. Clara is currently serving her sentence in Virginia's correctional system. Her case continues to be studied by those examining the intersection of online culture, fantasy role-playing, and violent crime. For Robert Schwartz's family and colleagues, her sentence provided some accountability for a brilliant scientist's life being ended by his own daughter's descent into fantasy-fueled delusion. The Clara Schwartz case raised questions about parental monitoring of children's online activities, the potential risks of obsessive immersion in fantasy worlds, and how warning signs might be identified before obsession turns violent. While the vast majority of gaming enthusiasts never experience such detachment from reality, Clara's story serves as cautionary evidence that for susceptible individuals, fantasy can become dangerous when it replaces rather than supplements actual life. Yet while Clara's crime emerged from internal fantasy, the final case would demonstrate how a seemingly ordinary student could shatter a community with an attack that transformed a university bus into a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Case 10. Christopher Darnell, Jones Jr. Campus life promises growth, friendship, and opportunity. Promises that shattered on a November evening when gunfire erupted on a charter bus returning from a field trip, turning teammates into victims and security into illusion. Christopher Darnell, Jones Jr. enrolled at the University of Virginia like thousands of other students seeking education and personal development. He'd grown up in the region, graduating from Petersburg High School before making his way to Charlottesville. To many who encountered him casually, he seemed unremarkable, a young man navigating college life without drawing particular attention. But beneath that ordinary surface existed volatility that would eventually erupt with devastating consequences. Jones walked onto UVA's football team, meaning he'd earned his position through tryouts rather than scholarship recruiting. He practiced alongside scholarship players, including Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis Jr., and Deshaun Perry, three talented athletes who'd come to UVA with promising futures ahead. Teammates later described Jones as someone who kept to himself, didn't integrate fully into team culture, and occasionally displayed concerning behavior that raised questions about his stability. By November 2022, Jones was no longer on the team's active roster, but remained a student at UVA. On November 13th, he accompanied a group on an academic field trip to Washington, D.C. The excursion proceeded without incident until the charter bus began its return trip to Charlottesville that evening. Students settled into seats, some sleeping, others conversing quietly about the day's activities. Jones sat among them, outwardly calm. As the bus traveled through the darkness, Jones retrieved a firearm. Without warning or apparent provocation, he opened fire on his fellow students. The enclosed space of the charter bus meant there was nowhere to escape, no cover to seek. Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis Jr., and Deshaun Perry, all football players. Jones had known from his time with the team, were struck. Two other students sustained injuries, but survived. The shooting lasted only moments, but in that brief period, 3 young lives ended, and 2 others were forever altered. The bus driver managed to bring the vehicle to a stop. Survivors scrambled to escape while others attempted to help the wounded. Emergency services responded rapidly. But for Chandler, Davis, and Perry, assistance came too late. They died from their injuries, 3 athletes cut down by someone who'd once stood beside them at practice. Jones fled the scene, triggering a massive manhunt across central Virginia. The university locked down as authorities worked to locate him. Students sheltered in place, while helicopters scoured the area and law enforcement coordinated across jurisdictions. For nearly 12 hours, fear gripped the campus and surrounding community. Finally, on November 14th, police apprehended Jones in Henrico County. He was taken into custody without resistance. The aftermath brought profound grief to UVA. The three deceased football players had been beloved figures, talented athletes with bright futures, now forever extinguished. Memorial services drew thousands. Teammates struggled to comprehend how someone they'd known could commit such violence. Head coach Tony Elliott and university leadership faced impossible tasks, comforting a community devastated by senseless loss. Investigation revealed Jones had previously been on university officials' radar for concerning behavior. A threat assessment team had evaluated him months earlier, though no actions had been taken that prevented the tragedy. Questions emerged about whether warning signs had been missed, whether intervention might have been possible, whether systems designed to identify troubled students had failed. Jones faced multiple charges, including 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated malicious wounding, and 5 counts of use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Rather than proceed to trial, Jones eventually accepted a plea agreement. On November 20th, 2024, 2 years after the shootings, he pleaded guilty to all charges. Following a 4-day sentencing hearing in late November 2025, family members of the victims delivered impact statements describing the devastation Jones had caused. They spoke of sons, brothers, and friends whose potential would never be realized, whose dreams had been stolen by someone's incomprehensible decision to bring violence into their lives. Jones offered no explanation that could make sense of his actions, leaving families with questions that would never be satisfactorily answered. On November 21st, 2025, the court sentenced him to 5 consecutive life terms, plus 23 additional years, ensuring he'll remain imprisoned for the remainder of his natural life. The shooting prompted nationwide discussion about campus safety, threat assessment protocols, and how universities can better identify and intervene with students exhibiting concerning behaviors. UVA implemented additional security measures and reviewed its threat assessment procedures, though no system can eliminate risk entirely when someone is determined to commit violence. Christopher Darnell Jones Jr. now serves his 5 life sentences in Virginia's prison system. The 3 young men he took from this world, Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis Jr., and Deshaun Perry, are remembered through scholarships, memorial gatherings, and the ongoing pain of families who lost irreplaceable sons. The survivors carry physical and emotional scars that will remain with them permanently. The UVA shooting serves as a grim reminder that violence can erupt in environments where it seems least expected, that tragedy doesn't announce itself in advance, that ordinary moments can transform instantly into the worst day of countless lives. For the University of Virginia community, November 13th, 2022, remains a dividing line between before and after, innocence and awareness, security and vulnerability that can never be fully restored. 10 cases, 10 lives forever altered by choices made in moments of rage, greed, desperation, or calculated cruelty. From Susan Cummings walking free after 57 days, to Christopher Darnell Jones spending 5 lifetimes behind bars, Virginia's criminal justice system has grappled with questions that have no easy answers. These stories remind us that monsters rarely announce themselves. They live next door, work ordinary jobs, and hide behind smiles until the moment everything changes. If these cases revealed anything about human nature that unsettled you, wait until you see what we've uncovered next. Click that notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming videos. More shocking true crime cases are waiting, and trust us, you won't want to miss a single story. Until next time. Stay safe out there.